Welcome to Anonna's creation. Tonight, we begin a story you might think you know, but we will explore it in a world of gleaming chrome and silent servers, a world of genius and ambition. This is a modern retelling of a timeless myth, a story about a father and a son, and the perilous, intoxicating dream of touching the sky. This is the story of Daniel and Leo, and the danger of flying too high. Our story begins not on an ancient island, but on a marvel of modern engineering, Ethelgard Island, a private technological paradise floating like a jewel in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It was a place born from the mind of a genius, a man named Daniel Ashford. Daniel was not a king or a conqueror. He was an architect, an inventor, a visionary whose mind worked in blueprints and equations. He could see the future in a block of raw silicon and could weave miracles from lines of code. And on this island, he had built his masterpiece. Ethelgard wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of innovation, powered by geothermal vents from the ocean floor and run by an AI of Daniel's own design. The air was always a perfect 72 degrees, the gardens bloomed with impossible, genetically perfect flowers, and the laboratories within its central spire hummed with the sound of creation. It was a gilded cage, and for a long time, Daniel Ashford hadn't realized he was the one locked inside. His son, Leo, had been born here. He was a child of the island, a boy who knew nothing but the whisper of the automated recycling systems and the taste of hydroponically grown strawberries. At 17, Leo was his father's opposite. Where Daniel was measured, quiet, and burdened by the weight of his own intellect, Leo was a spark of raw energy. His laughter echoed in the sterile hallways, and his spirit was as untamed as the ocean that surrounded their perfect prison. He saw the island not as a cage, but as a playground. He would race the automated security drones along the pristine beaches and climb the sheer glass walls of the central spire, much to his father's quiet terror. The master of this island, the man who owned the genius of Daniel Ashford, was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a name whispered in boardrooms and government halls across the globe. He was a titan of industry, a man whose wealth and influence were so vast they were almost abstract. He hadn't built his empire with his own hands, but with an almost supernatural ability to find men like Daniel and harness their brilliance for his own. He had given Daniel unlimited resources, an entire island to be his canvas. In return, Daniel had given him Project Chimera, a revolutionary energy source so powerful it could reshape the world. And that was the problem. Chimera was too powerful. In creating it, Daniel realized he had handed a godlike weapon to a man with the ambition of a Caesar. When Daniel expressed his desire to leave, to introduce his son to a world beyond the island's horizon, Thorne's cordial mask had slipped. The private jets stopped arriving. The supply ships were scheduled with military precision, their crews forbidden from speaking to the island's two inhabitants. The invisible walls of their gilded cage slowly became chillingly real. They were not pioneers on Ethelgard Island, they were prisoners of Marcus Thorne's ambition. Thorne would never let the mind behind Project Chimera walk free. Daniel felt the weight of his mistake every day. He saw it in his son's restless eyes, the yearning for a world he'd only seen on screens. Leo would spend hours watching old movies, his face illuminated by the flickering light, mesmerized by images of crowded cities, chaotic traffic, and sprawling, imperfect suburbs. "Dad," he'd ask, his voice filled with a painful sort of wonder, "what does rain smell like on hot asphalt?" How could Daniel explain that he had traded that simple, beautiful reality for this sterile perfection? How could he tell his son that his own genius had trapped them both? The guilt was a constant, heavy cloak. The idea came to him, as all his great ideas did, not in a flash of inspiration, but as a quiet observation. He was standing on the highest balcony of the spire, watching a pair of sea eagles ride the thermal updrafts. They soared without effort, masters of the wind and the open sky. They were everything he and Leo were not, free. They could leave this island whenever they pleased. They were not bound by Thorne's security systems, his satellite surveillance, or his silent, ever-watching drones. For weeks, the thought was a secret obsession. During the day, he maintained the island's systems, running diagnostics on the very AI that kept him captive. He spoke with Leo, answered his questions, and feigned a sense of normalcy he was far from feeling. But at night, in the privacy of his personal workshop, a new blueprint began to take shape on his datapad. It was not a plan for a new power source or a more efficient AI. It was a design of impossible elegance and desperate hope. He studied the sea eagles obsessively, using the island's high-powered telescopes to analyze the structure of their wings, the subtle flex of each primary feather as it caught the wind. He ran simulations, thousands of them, calculating lift, drag, and material stress. The materials would have to come from what he had available. Thorne's supply shipments were meticulously catalogued, but Daniel was the one who had designed the inventory system. He knew its loopholes. A carbon fiber chassis from a decommissioned drone. a roll of ultralight, ripstop polymer fabric from the atmospheric research lab, and the adhesive, the most critical component, a thermosensitive resin he had developed for sealing microfractures in the geothermal conduits. It was strong, but it had a weakness. Intense heat caused it to lose its cohesion. One evening, Leo found him on the balcony, staring out at the endless blue horizon, his face etched with a look of intense concentration Leo hadn't seen in years. "What are you looking at, Dad?" Leo asked, leaning on the railing beside him. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He pointed a finger towards an eagle, a tiny speck circling high above them. "Look at that, Leo. Look at the freedom in that movement. No engines, no fuel. Just engineering. Perfect, natural engineering." Leo watched the bird for a moment. "It's just a bird, Dad." "Is it?" Daniel turned to face his son, his eyes burning with a new, fierce light. "Or is it a key? Is it a blueprint for escape?" Leo stared at him, confusion clouding his features. "Escape? Dad, how? We can't swim that far. A boat would be spotted in seconds." Daniel allowed a small, rare smile to touch his lips. He put a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that was both reassuring and heavy with unspoken meaning. "We're not going to go across the water, Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a secret shared between a father and his son against the vastness of the sky. "We're going to go over it. We're going to fly." Leo stared at his father, the words hanging in the air between them, seeming as thin and improbable as the clouds drifting far below. Fly. The word was absurd, a fantasy from the comic books he secretly read on his tablet. Yet, the look in his father's eyes was not one of fantasy. It was the same look he had when he was solving an impossible equation, a gaze of intense, unshakable certainty. For the first time, the faint, flickering ember of hope Leo had guarded in his heart for years ignited into a brilliant flame. "How?" Leo finally whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and soaring excitement. "Dad, seriously, how?" Daniel's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His gaze was already distant, calculating angles and stresses. "With knowledge, Leo. The same knowledge that built this island, that powers every system within it. Marcus Thorne thinks he has caged my mind. He's about to find out that a mind can't be caged. It can only be pointed in a new direction. Now, come with me. We have work to do, and we have to be invisible while we do it." That night marked the beginning of their secret life. After the island's automated systems dimmed the lights for the designated sleep cycle, Daniel and Leo would slip out of their living quarters. Daniel, using a master override code he had embedded deep within the island's operating system years ago as a personal failsafe, guided them through silent service corridors and down stairwells that were not on any official schematic. Their destination was a decommissioned server farm in the lowest subbasement of the central spire. It was a cold, cavernous room filled with silent, monolithic racks of outdated hardware. The air was thick with the smell of dust and cold metal. To the island's AI, this room was obsolete, a digital graveyard. To Daniel and Leo, it became their sanctuary, their workshop, their path to the sky. The first phase was acquisition. Under the guise of routine maintenance and system upgrades, Daniel began to requisition materials. He was a ghost in his own machine. A damaged maintenance drone, scheduled for incineration, was reported destroyed, but not before Daniel had carefully stripped it of its lightweight carbon fiber struts and microservos. He put in a work order for a new atmospheric sensor array for the weather station, claiming the old one was malfunctioning. When the crate arrived on the weekly supply ship, Leo helped him haul it to the subbasement. They kept the new sensor, but they also kept the high-tensile polymer fabric it was packed in, a material designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. Piece by piece, their impossible project took shape. Leo, who had grown up with a restless energy that often bordered on destructive, now found a purpose for his hands. He learned to sand the carbon fiber rods until they were smooth as glass, to handle the delicate polymer fabric without tearing it. He watched his father work, mesmerized. Daniel was no longer just his dad, the quiet, distant man lost in thought. He was a master craftsman, his hands moving with a grace and precision that seemed almost magical. He mapped out the wing design on a large console, a complex lattice of supports and flexible joints modeled directly from the bone structure of a sea eagle. "Every piece has to be perfect, Leo," Daniel explained one night, his voice low and serious as he calibrated a servo motor. "There's no room for error. Not one. The forces we'll be dealing with up there, they are unforgiving." Leo, busy stretching the polymer skin over a finished section of the wing frame, paused. "What do you mean?" Daniel stopped his work and looked at his son. "I mean the design is balanced on a knife's edge. The harness has to distribute our weight perfectly. The wings have to be angled to catch the updraft from the cliffs, giving us our initial lift. But there are two great dangers, two variables I can only account for, not control. He pointed to the roll of fabric. This material is strong, but it's not invincible. If it gets too saturated with sea spray, it will grow heavy, its aerodynamic properties will change, and it could lose lift. We fly too low, the ocean will try to pull us down. He then picked up a small canister of the thermosensitive resin, the glue that would hold everything together. And this is our greatest strength, and our greatest weakness. This resin bonds the fabric to the frame with incredible strength. But it is fundamentally unstable at high temperatures. We fly too close to the sun, its direct, unfiltered rays will heat the black carbon frame, the resin will soften, and the wings will come apart. Leo listened, but to him, it sounded like a technical problem, another equation his father had already solved. He couldn't feel the danger in his bones the way Daniel did. He could only feel the thrum of the powerful machine taking shape before him, the promise of the open sky. The warnings were just words. The dream was a tangible thing, smelling of resin and metal, growing larger in their secret workshop every night. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The 2 wing frames were completed, skeletal and beautiful, leaning against the far wall of the server room like the remains of some prehistoric bird. They were enormous, each spanning nearly 15 feet. Daniel had integrated the small servos from the drones into the design, allowing for subtle adjustments to the wing shape in flight, controlled by a small joystick that would be mounted on the harness. It was a fusion of ancient design and modern technology, a desperate, brilliant hybrid. One night, they reached a critical milestone. Daniel had finished the harness system for Leo's wings. It was a complex vest of straps and load-bearing buckles, designed to fit his son's lean frame perfectly. "All right," Daniel said, his voice tense with anticipation. "Let's test the load distribution. Put it on." Leo slipped into the harness, his heart pounding. Daniel tightened the straps, his movements precise and methodical. Then, he attached the harness to a heavy-duty chain hoist they had salvaged from the engineering bay. Slowly, he began to crank the handle. Leo's feet lifted off the ground. He was suspended 3 feet in the air, held aloft by the very harness that would soon connect him to the sky. He twisted and turned, testing its comfort and strength. It held firm. A wide, uncontainable grin spread across Leo's face as he dangled in the air. "It works, Dad. It actually works." Looking up at his son, suspended in the dusty air of their hidden workshop, Daniel felt a surge of both pride and terrifying dread. The dream was becoming real. And with every step closer to their escape, the 2 great dangers he had warned Leo about, the grasping sea below and the burning sun above, loomed larger in his own mind. He had designed the wings, but he could not design his son's character. He could build the apparatus for flight, but he could not control the soul of the man who would wear it. The successful harness test marked a turning point. The project was no longer a theoretical exercise confined to datapads and hushed conversations. It was real. The wings, now nearly fully assembled, dominated their secret workshop. They were magnificent, terrifying things, their black carbon frames and translucent polymer skin absorbing the low light of the server room, seeming to hold a silent promise of flight. The reality of what they were about to attempt began to settle upon them, and with it came a new, sharper kind of fear. It was the fear not of failure, but of consequence. This fear was given a voice a week later. They were in the workshop, Daniel making a final calibration to the servo actuators in Leo's right wing, when a soft chime echoed from the datapad on the workbench. Daniel froze, his hand hovering over the delicate wiring. On the screen, a single line of text glowed ominously. "System alert, initiating island-wide integrity sweep. LVL-5 diagnostic bots deployed." Daniel's blood ran cold. A level 5 sweep was unprecedented. It meant Thorne was paranoid about something. It meant bots would be patrolling every sector, including decommissioned ones, scanning for structural anomalies, unauthorized power draws, anything out of the ordinary. "Leo," Daniel whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "Kill the lights. Now." The room plunged into darkness, save for the single red light on the datapad. "We have to hide everything," Daniel said, his words clipped and precise. "The wings go behind the server racks in the back. Cover them with the old insulation tarps. All the tools, every last scrap of carbon fiber, put them inside the empty server casings." Adrenaline surged through Leo. They moved with a frantic, silent efficiency. The wings were surprisingly light but awkward. They maneuvered the massive frames into the narrow space behind a row of monolithic servers, their movements clumsy in the near-total darkness. They threw dusty, stiff tarps over them, hoping they would look like forgotten equipment. Tools were hastily shoved into empty metal boxes. The doors clicked shut. Just as Leo slid the last stray bolt into a drawer, they heard it. A faint, high-pitched whirring sound, growing steadily closer. It was accompanied by a rhythmic, soft clicking. A diagnostic bot. Its treads were designed for silent movement, but in the dead quiet of the sub-basement, it sounded like a drumbeat of approaching doom. Daniel grabbed Leo's arm and pulled him behind a different rack, pressing them both flat against the cold metal. They held their breath. The whirring grew louder, and a thin beam of blue light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the room. It danced over the spot where the wings had just been, lingered on the tarp, then continued its methodical scan. The bot paused at the entrance to their workshop, its optical sensor a single, unblinking blue eye. It pivoted, its head rotating as it scanned the heat signatures in the room. Daniel could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He was sure it could hear them, see the heat of their terrified bodies. An eternity passed in that single, silent moment. Then, with a soft electronic chirp, the bot seemed satisfied. Its blue light retracted, it turned, and the whirring sound began to fade as it continued its patrol down the long corridor. They waited in the suffocating darkness for a full 10 minutes after the sound had vanished completely before Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe. He flicked on a single low-power lamp, bathing the room in a weak, yellow glow. Leo was pale, his hands clenched into fists. The close call had shattered their sense of security. Their secret sanctuary now felt like a trap. "He's looking for something," Daniel said, his voice grim. "Or he's just tightening the leash. Either way, we're out of time. We have to go. Soon." Leo nodded, the bravado he usually wore like armor completely gone, replaced by a raw understanding of their situation. "When?" "I've been monitoring the long-range weather patterns," Daniel replied, pulling up a complex chart on his datapad. "There's a pressure system moving in. In 3 days, it will generate a steady, powerful offshore wind. The perfect current to carry us away from the island and towards the shipping lanes. The skies will be clear, no cloud cover. It's the ideal window. It might be the only one we get. 3 days." The number hung in the air, both a death sentence and a promise of salvation. That night, Daniel sat Leo down. The time for gentle encouragement was over. "You heard what I said about the dangers, Leo," he began, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But I need you to understand it, not just hear it. Look." He pulled up a simulation, a 3D model of a winged figure in flight. "This is us. This red line is the maximum thermal tolerance of the resin. It corresponds to an altitude of about 20,000 feet. Above that, the solar radiation is unfiltered. The black carbon frame will absorb it like a sponge, the resin will turn to liquid, and the wings will disintegrate. Not might, Leo. Will." He adjusted the simulation. "This green line is the minimum safe altitude. About 500 feet. Below that, the air is thick with moisture and unpredictable turbulence from the water's surface. The polymer skin will get waterlogged, become heavy, and you'll lose control. It will drag you into the ocean." He looked his son directly in the eye, his gaze filled with a desperate paternal intensity. "The flight path is a corridor, a safe space between the sun and the sea. You cannot be a hero. You cannot get lost in the thrill of it. You must be a pilot. You must be disciplined. You follow my lead, you maintain your altitude, and you do not deviate from the path. This is the most important thing I will ever teach you. Do you promise me you understand?" "I understand, Dad," Leo said, and in that moment, he believed he did. He saw the physics, the clean lines on the chart. He saw it as a set of rules for a game he was determined to win. The final 72 hours were a blur of quiet, focused activity. They ate their meals in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. They spent every possible moment in the workshop, making the last, tiny adjustments. They checked every strap, every bolt, every seam. They rehearsed the launch sequence over and over, a synchronized dance they would have to perform on the cliff edge. On the final night, they stood before their creations. The wings were finished, polished, and perfect. They leaned against the server racks, no longer looking like skeletons, but like living things, humming with a silent, terrible potential. Everything in Daniel's life, his genius, his failures, his love for his son, had been poured into this single, desperate gamble. Tomorrow, they would strap these massive, fragile constructions to their backs and leap from the highest cliff on Ethelgard Island into the vast, empty sky. Tomorrow, they would either find their freedom or their graves in the endless blue. The morning of their escape arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the cold, sterile silence of a pre-dawn Tuesday. The island's automated systems filled their breakfast dispenser at precisely 0600 hours, as always. Daniel and Leo sat opposite each other at the small table in their quarters, the synthetic nutrient paste untouched. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. Every routine sound, the gentle hum of the air purifier, the distant whisper of the ocean, felt amplified, a countdown timer to the most significant moment of their lives. Their journey began in the familiar darkness of the service corridors. Carrying the wings was an ordeal. Despite their light weight, their sheer size made them incredibly awkward. They navigated the narrow passages like a clumsy, four-winged creature, the tips of the carbon fiber frames scraping against pipes and conduits with sounds that echoed like gunshots in the silence. Leo's muscles burned, and sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't dare make a sound. Daniel led the way, his datapad in one hand, monitoring the patrol routes of the security drones. Twice, they had to press themselves into shadowy alcoves, holding their breath as a drone whirred past, its optical sensor sweeping the corridor just feet from their hiding place. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged through a final maintenance hatch onto the island's exterior. They were on a rocky trail, far from the manicured gardens, on the wind-swept northernmost point of Ethelgard. The air here was different. It was wild and cold, tasting of salt and freedom. Before them lay the launch point, a sheer cliff face that dropped a terrifying 800 feet to where the Pacific Ocean churned against black, jagged rocks below. The wind howled, a constant, powerful force, just as Daniel's predictions had promised. The sun was a brilliant orange line on the horizon, beginning to bleed color into the dark sky. This was the place. The point of no return. Wordlessly, they began the final ritual. They laid the wings on the flat ground and began the process of strapping into the harnesses. The clicks of the heavy-duty buckles were the only sounds they made. Daniel worked with a grim, focused efficiency, checking every strap on Leo's harness twice before starting on his own. He looked at his son, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes conveyed a universe of fear and hope. He gave Leo a single, sharp nod, a silent reminder of everything they had discussed, of the safe corridor between the sun and the sea. Daniel would go first. He had to. He had to prove to Leo that this insane dream was real. He stood at the edge of the cliff, the massive wings now attached to his back, extending like a part of his own body. The wind tugged at him, trying to pull him from the ledge. For a moment, he was just a man in a strange contraption, impossibly small against the vastness of the sky and sea. He ran a final diagnostic, the small servos in the wings whining as they adjusted to their launch positions. He took a deep breath. "I'll see you in the air, Leo," he shouted over the wind. And then he ran. He sprinted the 10 yards to the edge of the cliff and, without a moment's hesitation, he leaped. For Leo, watching, time seemed to slow down. He saw his father's form plummet, a gut-wrenching drop towards the rocks below. It was a fall, not a flight. A terrible, fatal miscalculation. Leo's heart seized in his chest, a scream catching in his throat. But then, it happened. Just as Daniel had simulated 1,000 times, he angled the wings sharply into the powerful updraft rising from the cliff face. The polymer fabric billowed, catching the air with a sound like a thunderclap. The terrifying fall arrested, transforming into a graceful, sweeping curve. Daniel Ashford was flying. He soared upwards, a magnificent, man-made bird climbing against the dawn. A crackle came to life in the small earpiece Leo wore. It was his father's voice, breathless and filled with a wild, triumphant joy. "It works, Leo. It works. Your turn. Run straight ahead and don't stop. Leap with everything you have." Seeing his father carving arcs against the sunrise banished Leo's fear, replacing it with a surge of pure, uncontainable exhilaration. This was real. This was happening. It was his turn. He backed up, took a deep breath, and sprinted towards the edge of the world. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his legs pumping, the wind roaring in his ears. He didn't look down. He looked up, at the sky, at his father, at the freedom that awaited. He reached the edge and leaped, pushing off the cliff with all his strength, flinging himself into the abyss. The fall was terrifying, a stomach-lurching void that seemed to last forever. Panic flared in his chest. But his father's instructions, practiced and rehearsed for months, took over. He angled the wings, felt the violent shudder as the wind caught them, and then the incredible, impossible sensation of lift. He was no longer falling, he was rising. The sheer ecstasy of it was overwhelming. He let out a whoop of pure joy that was snatched away by the wind. Below him, the island of Ethelgard, his entire world, his prison, was shrinking, becoming a mere speck in the vast blue ocean. Ahead, his father flew, a steady and reassuring presence. And all around him, there was nothing but the sky. The glorious, open, and infinite sky. He tilted his wings, feeling the response, the effortless grace of the movement. He was a creature of the air. For the first time in his 17 years of life, Leo Ashford was truly, utterly free. and the feeling was more intoxicating than he could have ever dared to imagine. The first hour was pure magic. The terror of the launch gave way to a profound, breathtaking sense of wonder. Flying was not like being in a plane, insulated by metal and glass. It was a raw, visceral experience. They could feel the subtle shifts in the air currents, the pressure of the wind molding itself around them. The sun, now fully risen, warmed their backs, and the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean shimmered below them like a wrinkled sheet of sapphire. Daniel flew with the focused precision of an engineer. His movements were minimal and efficient, his body and wings working as a single, streamlined unit. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon and the small digital display on his wrist, which showed their altitude, airspeed, and heading. He was the pilot, the navigator, the mission commander. His mind was on the journey, the long miles of open ocean that still lay between them and the safety of the mainland. Leo, however, was not on a journey. He was living in a dream. He flew with the uninhibited joy of a creature born to the sky. He laughed into the wind, the sound instantly stolen by the rushing air. He banked and soared, not to navigate, but simply for the pleasure of the movement. He was a musician, and the sky was his instrument. "Can you believe this, Dad?" His voice crackled in Daniel's earpiece, giddy with excitement. "We're actually doing it. We're flying." "Focus, Leo." Daniel's voice was a calm, steady counterpoint. "Maintain an altitude of 3,000 feet. We need to stay in the core of this air current to conserve energy." Right, 3,000 feet, Leo replied, but his attention was already elsewhere. Below them, a pod of dolphins broke the surface of the water, leaping and playing in the waves. Leo was mesmerized. Without thinking, he dipped the nose of his wings and entered a shallow dive, spiraling downwards for a closer look. The world tilted around him. The speed of his descent pushed him back into his harness, and the sound of the wind rose from a roar to a high-pitched scream. It was thrilling. The dolphins were clearer now, sleek gray bodies arcing through the blue. He dropped lower and lower, the fine details of the ocean surface becoming sharp and clear. "Leo, what are you doing?" Daniel's voice was suddenly sharp, cutting through Leo's exhilaration. "You're dropping too fast. Pull up. Now." The command startled him. He looked at his wrist display. Altitude, 600 feet. He was already dangerously close to the minimum safe altitude. He could feel the air growing heavy and moist, and a fine salty spray kissed his face. He pulled back, and the wings strained for a moment before catching the air, lifting him back into a steady climb. He leveled off beside his father, his heart still pounding from the thrill of the dive. "I saw dolphins, Dad," he said, a little defensively. "I saw them too," Daniel replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I also saw you fly directly into the danger zone I explicitly warned you about. The sea spray, Leo. It's not just water. It will cling to the fabric, add weight, and disrupt the airflow. A few moments longer down there, and you would have been fighting for control." "But I had it under control," Leo insisted. "These wings are incredible. You built them so well." The compliment did not soothe Daniel's anxiety. It did the opposite. "They are built to operate within specific parameters, Leo, not to indulge your curiosity. The rules are not suggestions. They are the only thing keeping us alive. Stay in the corridor." Leo fell silent, chastened. He flew obediently beside his father, but a seed of resentment had been planted. The boundless freedom he had felt just moments before now seemed to have limits, rules, and a constant voice of caution in his ear. He looked up. The sun was higher now, a brilliant white disk in the deep blue sky. It felt warm, powerful, and inviting. He wondered what it would be like up there, high above the world, where the air was thin and clear. He could almost feel the pull of it, the siren song of the upper atmosphere. His father was a genius, of that there was no doubt. He had gotten them off the island. He had given them the sky. But as Leo soared through the air, feeling the immense power harnessed to his back, a dangerous thought began to form in his mind. Perhaps his father, for all his brilliance, was too cautious. Perhaps he had designed these wings to be stronger than he realized. Perhaps the dangers he feared were just theoretical limits, ghosts in his equations. The corridor his father insisted upon felt safe, yes, but it also felt like a cage, just a much larger one than the island he had just escaped. And Leo Ashford had no intention of ever being in a cage again. Noon found them suspended between an indifferent sun and a limitless ocean. The journey had settled into a grueling monotony. The sun, now directly overhead, beat down relentlessly, and the initial magic of flight had been baked away, leaving behind the stark reality of their undertaking. Every muscle in Leo's back and shoulders ached from the strain of maintaining stability against the constant wind. The horizon, once a symbol of infinite possibility, was now just an unchanging line, a destination that never seemed to get any closer. His restlessness grew, a frantic energy building in his chest with nowhere to go. The world had become a predictable, 3,000-foot-high channel of air. Below, the forbidden sea. Above, the forbidden sun. Leo felt the walls of his father's safe corridor closing in on him, and it felt maddeningly similar to the walls of Ethelgard. "Dad!" Leo's voice crackled in the earpiece, edgy and impatient. "This is taking forever. I have an idea." "We're making good time, Leo," Daniel replied, his voice calm and even, though he too was feeling the physical toll. "Just maintain your focus. We're on schedule." "No, listen," Leo pressed. "If we climb, the air will be thinner. Less drag. We could fly faster, be more efficient. We could get there hours earlier." He framed it in his father's language, the language of logic and efficiency, hoping it would be a key to unlock his prison. The response was immediate and absolute. "No. Leo, we are not having this discussion again. The plan is the plan for a reason. The risk of solar radiation at higher altitudes is not a theory, it's a certainty. The answer is no." The flat finality in his father's tone made something in Leo snap. All the years of confinement, of living under his father's quiet but absolute authority, of dreaming of a world he couldn't touch, it all boiled over in a single fiery wave of defiance. "Why not?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Why did you build these wings if you were just going to be afraid to use them? What's the point of being able to fly if we have to stay on this one boring, invisible road in the sky? This isn't freedom, Dad. It's just a different kind of cage. This is survival." Daniel's voice was sharp now, a warning. "Discipline is what's keeping us alive. Your recklessness will kill us both. No, your fear is what's holding us back." Leo shouted, his frustration finally eclipsing his reason. "I'm done following your rules." And with that, he angled his wings upwards. The movement was sharp, decisive, and irreversible. He broke formation, leaving his father's side and beginning a powerful, determined ascent into the forbidden upper reaches of the sky. "Leo, no!" Daniel's voice screamed in his ear, a sound of pure panic. "Stop. Son, turn back. Please, listen to me. You don't understand what you're doing." But Leo wasn't listening. He shut out his father's frantic pleas, the words dissolving into the roar of the wind. A wild sense of liberation surged through him. He was finally in control, making his own decisions, flying his own path. The upward climb was intoxicating. The great blue dome of the sky seemed to open up, welcoming him. He glanced down. His father was already falling behind, a smaller, desperate figure gesturing wildly. Below him, the ocean was a distant, abstract painting. He was rising above it all. As he climbed higher, the air grew crisp and thin. Just as he'd predicted, there was less resistance. He felt lighter, faster, more powerful than ever. A triumphant grin spread across his face. He was right. His father had been wrong. The fear was baseless, a ghost in the machine. He had been so worried about the resin, the heat, the equations. But here, in the real world, Leo felt nothing but speed and power. He continued to climb, higher and higher. 10,000 feet. 15,000. The sun was no longer just a warm presence. It was a brilliant, blinding force, a celestial furnace that seemed to fill his entire vision. He felt its intense, unfiltered rays on his back and on the black carbon fiber frames of his wings. It felt like glory. It felt like pure, unadulterated power. He was soaring towards the heavens, a new god of the sun, leaving his cautious earthbound father far behind in the safe, boring world below. He was finally, truly, gloriously free. Higher and higher Leo soared, a defiant spear aimed at the heart of the sun. He climbed past 20,000 feet, entering a realm of breathtaking, lethal beauty. The sky was no longer a familiar blue but a deep, bruised violet that faded to black at its highest edge. Below him, the world was a perfect, sweeping curve, the blue of the Pacific so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. He was above the world. He felt a sense of divine power, a dizzying ecstasy that erased all thought of his father's warnings. He had done it. He had touched the face of God, and it was glorious. The sun was an immense, silent explosion overhead. It was not a light, it was a presence. A crushing, overwhelming force. He felt its heat not as warmth, but as a physical pressure on his back, a relentless weight pressing down on the black wings. At first, he welcomed it as a sign of his triumph. But the pressure grew, becoming an uncomfortable, penetrating heat that seeped through the fabric of his flight suit and the straps of his harness. Then came the smell. a sharp, chemical odor, like burning plastic, that cut through the clean, thin air. Leo frowned, his euphoric haze momentarily disturbed. He tilted his head, trying to place the scent. It was coming from the wings. From his own back. A flicker of unease, the first cold drop of fear, touched his heart. He risked a glance over his shoulder. What he saw made his blood run cold. Along the main strut of his right wing, where the polymer fabric met the carbon fiber frame, the seam was rippling. It looked wet, glistening strangely in the intense sunlight. The resin, the perfect adhesive his father had created, was softening, turning from a solid bond into a thick, useless tar. A tiny, terrifying wisp of black smoke curled up from the joint. "No," Leo whispered, the word lost in the vast silence. He tried to bank, to turn, to begin a descent. But the controls felt sluggish, unresponsive. The wings, which had felt like an extension of his own body just moments before, now felt like alien, disobedient limbs. A loud creak echoed from the left wing, a sound of stressed, failing material. His perfect, graceful flight became a clumsy, terrifying wobble. Panic, cold and absolute, replaced his hubris. His father's words, the warnings he had dismissed as fear, came screaming back into his mind. The resin will soften, the wings will come apart. He was too high. He was far, far too high. From his position in the safe corridor thousands of feet below, Daniel could only watch. He had been shouting his son's name into the radio for what felt like an eternity, his voice raw with terror, pleading with him to turn back. But there was no response. He watched Leo's silhouette, a tiny speck against the sun, climb to an impossible height. And then he saw it. A subtle, unnatural flutter in the boy's flight path. It wasn't a turn. It was a stumble. "Leo!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Son, descend. Enter a controlled dive. Now, listen to me." But it was too late. High above, Leo's world fell apart. There was a sudden, violent crack, like a bone snapping. The main joint of the right wing gave way. The thermosensitive resin, now liquid, lost all cohesion. The polymer fabric ripped away from the frame with a sound like a sail tearing in a hurricane. The wing folded, collapsing in on itself. The sudden, catastrophic loss of lift sent Leo into an uncontrollable spiral. The sky and the sea became a spinning, nauseating blur of blue and white. The wind was no longer a roar of flight. It was a demonic shriek, tearing at him as he plummeted towards the earth. He fought the controls, his movements useless and frantic. He was no longer a pilot. He was just a boy strapped to a broken machine, falling from an impossible height. Daniel watched in utter, soul-shattering horror. He saw the wing collapse. He saw his son's controlled ascent transform into a chaotic, tumbling fall. It was a broken bird, a discarded toy, a falling star. He angled his own wings, pushing them to their absolute limit in a desperate, futile attempt to catch him, to somehow reverse the unchangeable laws of physics and fate. But the distance was too great. Leo fell. For 30 seconds that stretched into a horrifying eternity, he fell. In his last moments, there was no anger, no defiance, only a single crushing thought that eclipsed all others. Dad was right. He screamed a name that no one could hear. Daniel saw the impact. A distant, violent splash in the impossibly vast and serene ocean. A bloom of white foam that quickly dissipated, leaving the surface as smooth and untroubled as if nothing had ever happened. His son was gone. The radio in his ear, once filled with Leo's laughter and defiance, was now utterly silent. And in that moment, Daniel Ashford, the genius who had built a paradise and forged wings to escape it, was plunged into a new kind of prison, one made of crushing guilt and a silence more absolute and eternal than any he had ever known. The sky was silent. The sun, which had been the instrument of his son's destruction, now seemed to mock Daniel with its indifferent brilliance. He hovered in the air, his wings automatically adjusting to the currents, a perfect machine performing its function for a pilot whose world had ceased to exist. In his earpiece, the silence was a physical presence, a crushing weight far heavier than the pull of gravity. He kept listening, a desperate, irrational part of his brain expecting to hear Leo's voice crackle back to life, laughing it off as a joke. But there was nothing. There would never be anything again. His son was gone. The words were simple, but his mind refused to assemble them into a coherent reality. He had watched it happen, a distant, unbelievable horror. A splash. And then nothing. The vast, serene ocean had erased his child as easily as a breath fogging a window pane. Slowly, mechanically, Daniel began to descend. His movements were the opposite of his son's final, chaotic plunge. He flew in a slow, wide, mournful spiral, like a leaf falling from a dead tree. The wings, a marvel of engineering that had promised them freedom, now felt like a monstrous weight, a grotesque monument to his own hubris. He had given his son the sky, and in doing so, had sentenced him to death. The guilt was a physical sickness, churning in his stomach, a cold fire spreading through his veins. He leveled off just above the 500-foot boundary, the line his son had so carelessly crossed, and that he now patrolled like the border of hell. He circled the area where Leo had fallen, his eyes scanning the waves for something, anything. A piece of the black carbon frame. A shred of the polymer fabric. A sign that what he had seen was real, that his son had been here. But there was nothing. The Pacific was a perfect, unbroken canvas of blue. It kept its secrets. He flew in circles for what might have been minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. His mind was a maelstrom of self-recrimination, each thought a new turn of the knife. I built the wings. The thought was a relentless drumbeat. I put the tools of his own destruction in his hands. He heard their last argument replaying in his mind. Leo's voice, full of fire and frustration. This isn't freedom, Dad. It's just a different kind of cage. Had he been right? Had Daniel's caution, his rules, his safe corridor, been just another form of control? In his desperate attempt to protect his son from the world, had he inadvertently pushed him towards a more final, absolute form of destruction? The warnings he had given, the precise, scientific explanations of the dangers, offered no comfort now. They were just a testament to his failure. He had understood the physics of the flight perfectly, but he had failed to understand the fiery, untamable physics of his own son's heart. He had given a 17-year-old boy the power of a god, and had been surprised when he tried to fly to Olympus. Images of Leo flashed through his mind, unbidden and agonizing. Leo as a small child, chasing seagulls on the beaches of Ethelgard. Leo as a teenager, his face illuminated by a screen, asking what rain smelled like on hot asphalt. The terrible irony was that in his quest to give his son the world, he had only given him a few fleeting hours of a deadly illusion. The brutal logic of survival eventually pierced through his fog of grief. The sun was beginning to dip towards the west. The energy cells powering the wing servos were depleting. He was still a fugitive, alone, hundreds of miles from land. To stay here, circling his son's watery grave, was to die here. The act of turning away was the hardest thing he had ever done. He banked his wings, leaving the empty patch of ocean behind, and set a new course for the distant, unseen mainland. The journey was no longer an escape to freedom. It was a joyless, mechanical continuation of a life he no longer wanted. He flew on, not towards a new beginning, but away from the ghost in the water. The sky, which had promised liberation, was now a vast, empty tomb. Each rhythmic, silent beat of his wings was an echo of his failure, a reminder of the boy who had flown too high, and the father who would now and forever fly alone in the shadow of the sun. Twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. Daniel flew on, a solitary ghost against the dying light. The physical exhaustion was immense, a deep, grinding ache in his bones and muscles, but it was a welcome distraction from the hollow agony in his soul. When darkness fell completely, the world dissolved into an unnerving blackness above and below, and he was left alone with the cold, indifferent light of the stars. He navigated by them, just as ancient mariners had, though his primary guide was the glowing coordinate on his wrist display. The machine kept him on course, even as the man was hopelessly lost. 4 hours, he was a creature of the night sky, a silent observer of the moon's path across the celestial sphere. He thought of Leo, who would have been captivated by this spectacle. He would have pointed out constellations, his voice crackling with wonder in the earpiece. The memory was so vivid that for a heart-stopping moment, Daniel almost answered it. The silence that followed was more profound than the darkness. It was well past midnight when he saw it. Not land, but a faint, hazy glow on the horizon. A smudge of amber light pollution against the stars. Civilization. A city. The destination he had planned and dreamed of for years. He felt no triumph, no relief. It was merely the end of a line, the final, joyless conclusion to a catastrophic equation. As he drew closer, the single glow resolved into the distant lights of a coastal highway and the sparse lamps of a sleeping town. He began a slow, careful descent, leaving the empty freedom of the high altitudes for the cluttered, dangerous world below. He was no longer a soaring eagle but a hunted fugitive seeking cover. He flew low over the water, the rhythmic crash of waves on a shoreline now audible beneath the whisper of the wind through his wings. He chose his landing spot with the last vestiges of his tactical mind, a dark, isolated stretch of beach, miles from the nearest town, flanked by rocky outcrops and sand dunes. The approach was clumsy. The wings, so graceful in the open sky, were unwieldy and treacherous near the ground, susceptible to every gust of wind coming off the land. He didn't glide to a perfect landing. He came in too fast, misjudged his altitude, and ended up half stumbling, half crashing into the soft, forgiving sand. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring his weary body. The flight was over. For a long moment, he simply knelt there, the massive broken wings slumped on his back. He was on solid ground. He could feel the cool, damp sand beneath his hands. He could smell the rich, earthy scent of coastal vegetation mixed with the salt of the sea. He could hear the chirping of crickets from the dunes. These were the simple, terrestrial sensations his son had yearned to experience. The painful irony was a dagger in his heart. He had made it to the world Leo had dreamed of, but he had arrived alone. With movements stiff from exhaustion and grief, he unstrapped the harness. The weight of the wings lifted from his shoulders, and he felt a strange, hollow lightness. The apparatus lay on the sand behind him, a broken skeleton in the moonlight. It was the symbol of his greatest achievement and his most profound failure. It was his genius, his pride, and his son's coffin. It could not remain here. He dragged the wings, one by one, into a small, rocky cove, hidden from the open beach. The task was a penance. The carbon fiber that had seemed so light in the air was now a leaden weight. He did not need special tools to destroy his creation. He used his grief-fueled strength and the unyielding rocks. He snapped the delicate struts over his knee, the sharp crack of the carbon fiber echoing in the night. He tore the polymer fabric with his bare hands, ripping apart the very surfaces that had carried them through the sky. He took the small servos and control units and smashed them against a boulder until they were nothing but a tangle of wires and shattered plastic. He buried the pieces in the sand and under piles of rocks, performing a makeshift funeral for his dream. When it was done, he stood alone on the beach, an anonymous man with nothing but a worn flight suit and a ghost in his heart. He had escaped Marcus Thorne's island. By all measures, he was free. But as he looked out at the dark ocean that had taken everything from him, he knew he had only traded one prison for another, infinitely more vast and inescapable. He turned his back on the sea and began to walk inland, a solitary figure moving towards the distant, unknown lights. He had reached the land of the living, but his soul would remain forever adrift in the silent ocean with his son. Hours of walking on unfamiliar ground had left Daniel's legs feeling like lead. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom, a ghost leaving the sea behind. The wild, natural darkness of the coast slowly gave way to the artificial twilight of civilization. He found himself on the edge of a small, sleeping town, standing at a crossroads under the buzzing violet glare of a single streetlight. Before him was a 24-hour gas station, its fluorescent lights cutting a harsh, sterile rectangle out of the night. After nearly 2 decades on Ethelgard, a world of curated perfection and controlled silence, this new environment was a sensory assault. The air, thick with the smells of diesel exhaust, damp asphalt, and stale coffee from the gas station, was a shocking contrast to the filtered, scentless atmosphere of his island prison. The roar of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway was a physical blow, a violent noise in a life that had been composed of soft hums and synthesized chimes. This was the raw, unfiltered world. It was loud, dirty, and chaotic. It was everything Leo had wanted. A wave of nausea and grief washed over him so powerfully that he had to lean against the cold metal pole of a street sign to steady himself. He saw his son's face, eager and curious, and imagined his wonder at this gritty, mundane scene. The thought was unbearable. He needed to disappear, and his high-tech, form-fitting flight suit made him a glaring anomaly. He needed clothes, food, and money. He was a man who had redesigned the global energy grid, but he was now faced with the fundamental problems of a vagrant. He walked into the gas station's convenience store, the automatic door chiming his arrival. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, barely glanced at him before returning her attention to her phone. A couple of teenagers were laughing by the soda fountain. Leo's age. Daniel felt a physical pang in his chest and forced himself to look away, his gaze falling upon the racks of disposable phones and prepaid debit cards. An idea, a flicker of the old Daniel, sparked in the fog of his grief. He purchased a cheap coffee with the few emergency cash notes he had sewn into the lining of his suit. He sat at a small, grimy table, observing. He watched a customer use the ATM, noting its model, its network provider. He pulled out the small, powerful datapad he had kept, a device no bigger than a credit card, and shielded it from view. The gas station's public Wi-Fi was laughably insecure. For a mind like Daniel's, breaching it was trivial. From there, accessing the ATM service network was a simple, elegant puzzle. He wasn't a thief, he was a ghost slipping through the cracks. He didn't drain accounts. He initiated a series of fractional, untraceable microtransactions, rerouting them to activate one of the prepaid debit cards on the rack. It took less than 5 minutes. He left the datapad in the trash, wiping it remotely. The last link to his old life was gone. With a few hundred anonymous dollars at his disposal, he bought a change of clothes from a rack of tourist apparel, a plain black hoodie, a faded pair of jeans, and a baseball cap. In the station's restroom, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, he changed. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back was a stranger. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by grief. The visionary who had lectured at symposiums and built wonders for Marcus Thorne was gone. In his place was a tired, broken man in cheap clothes, his face obscured by the shadow of a cap. He was invisible. He was no one. He caught the first bus heading east, paying with his anonymous card and sinking into a seat at the back. As the town gave way to the open highway, the sun began to rise. Daniel watched the world he had sacrificed everything for slide past the dirty window. He saw billboards advertising cars he didn't recognize, teenagers waiting at a bus stop, a family eating breakfast in a roadside diner. Every mundane detail was a fresh torment. Each laughing teenager was a ghost of his son. Every advertisement promising freedom and adventure felt like a personal accusation. He had won. He had escaped Thorne's grasp and delivered himself to the real world. But it was a hollow victory. The freedom was a landscape, and his grief was the lens through which he would now see everything. He was finally anonymous, a perfect ghost in the machine of the modern world. But every neon sign, every passing car, every stranger's face was a mirror reflecting the one person he could never escape, the son he had led to his death. 6 months passed. The raw, open wound of Leo's death had scarred over into a dull, permanent ache. Daniel had found his anonymity in the sprawling, indifferent metropolis of a city whose name he barely bothered to learn. It was a place of endless streets and anonymous faces, a perfect forest for a man trying to hide from the world. His life was a study in deliberate monotony. He rented a small, bleak apartment above a laundromat, a single room where the smell of damp concrete and ozone was a constant presence. The furniture was sparse and functional, a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, a single chair. The room's only remarkable feature was the computer rig on a makeshift desk in the corner. It was a Frankenstein's monster of scavenged parts and second-hand components, assembled with a genius that was utterly at odds with its dingy surroundings. It was his only window, his only weapon. By day, he was a ghost. He worked the night shift at a massive commercial data processing center, a job that required no conversation and no identity beyond a number on a time card. He sat in a cubicle for 8 hours, transferring meaningless strings of information from one digital format to another. It was a mind-numbing, repetitive task, a fitting penance for a mind that had once reshaped the future. He spoke to no one. No one knew his name. His real work began when he returned to his apartment as the city was waking up. Fueled by cheap, bitter coffee, he would sit before his machine and slip back into the world he had created. He became a ghost in the global network, his digital presence a whisper in the static. His single, obsessive purpose was to watch his former captor. He moved through the encrypted networks of Thorne Industries like a phantom, never altering a single byte of data, never leaving a trace, simply observing. He needed to know if Marcus Thorne was looking for him. 4 months, there was nothing. The official corporate narrative surrounding Ethelgard Island was that a catastrophic geothermal event had caused a total loss of the facility and all personnel. It was a clean, simple lie. There were no search parties, no public announcements, no internal memos discussing the escape of a rogue scientist. A fragile, dangerous hope began to grow in Daniel's chest. Perhaps Thorne had cut his losses. Perhaps he believed Daniel and Leo had perished in their impossible flight. Perhaps he was finally, truly free. He almost allowed himself to believe it. He almost settled into the gray rhythm of his new life. But the past was never truly gone. One afternoon, while reviewing Thorne's encrypted R&D budgets, a routine he performed weekly, he noticed a new project, one that had been initiated the day after his escape. It was codenamed Project Shepherd, and its funding was astronomical, hidden behind layers of corporate misdirection. Curiosity, the old, familiar instinct of the scientist, took over. He spent the next 48 hours without sleep, carefully, painstakingly peeling back the layers of security around Project Shepherd. It wasn't a weapons program or a new energy source. It was something far more insidious. It was a global atmospheric and biometric tracking system, a network of next-generation satellites and ground-based sensors designed to scan for and identify unique energy signatures and unregistered biological markers on a planetary scale. His blood ran cold. He dug deeper, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He finally broke into the lead scientist's private logs, a file protected by a level of encryption that would have been unbreakable to anyone but its original architect. He found the project's mission statement, and the words on the screen seemed to steal the air from his lungs. Mission objective: to develop a system capable of locating and facilitating the retrieval of high-value corporate assets that have gone off-grid. Primary test case: tracking anomalous trans-Pacific atmospheric trajectories originating from Sector Gamma 7, Ethelgard, on or about the date of the incident. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a profound, chilling understanding dawning on him. Thorne hadn't given up. He hadn't written him off. He had simply escalated the hunt to a scale Daniel had never imagined. He wasn't sending men to look for him. He was building a god in the machine, a digital panopticon to systematically scan the entire planet for the one asset he refused to lose. His anonymity was an illusion. His quiet, miserable life wasn't a penance, it was just the space between the lightning and the thunder. He had tried to become a ghost, but Marcus Thorne was building a machine to hunt ghosts. And with every passing day, with every $1 billion poured into its development, it was getting closer. For a full minute, Daniel sat motionless, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his wide, horrified eyes. The hum of the computer's cooling fans was the only sound in the room, a sound that had once been a comfort but now felt like the breathing of a predator. The fragile piece he had carefully constructed over the past 6 months shattered into a million pieces. He was not a ghost, he was prey. The hunt had never stopped, it had just become silent, patient, and terrifyingly global. A cold, familiar clarity washed over him, displacing the fog of grief. This was a problem, an equation to be solved. And Daniel Ashford had always been a master of solving impossible equations. His objective, which for months had been simply to endure, had now shifted. It was no longer enough to hide. He had to run, to mislead, to fight. He was back in the labyrinth, but this time it wasn't made of stone walls or encrypted corporate networks. It was the entire world, and the Minotaur was a machine that could see everything. His Spartan apartment transformed from a monk's cell into a war room. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. 4 days on end, he worked, fueled by an obsessive, feverish energy. He was no longer a data entry clerk. He was the man who had designed the very systems Thorne was now using against him. He was the architect, and he knew where all the structural weaknesses were. He began to fight a war of ghosts. He couldn't destroy Project Shepherd, but he could poison its data. He wrote elegant, viciously complex algorithms designed to mimic the energy signature of his escape. He then unleashed these digital phantoms into the global network. One moment, a ghost signal would appear over the Siberian tundra. The next, a biometric anomaly would ping from a crowded marketplace in Marrakesh. He created 1,000 false Daniels, 1,000 phantom flights, sending Thorne's multi-billion-dollar machine on a wild goose chase across the planet. He became a creature of shadows, both physical and digital. He abandoned his apartment, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks, moving between anonymous motels and transient hotels. He paid for everything in cash. He walked with his head down, his cap pulled low, avoiding the ubiquitous gaze of security cameras. The world, which had been a landscape of his grief, was now a grid of threats and surveillance angles. This new, desperate fight took a severe toll. The constant paranoia was a corrosive acid, eating away at his already frayed nerves. But the deepest pain came from the cruel irony of his situation. He was using the same formidable intellect that had built Leo's wings to now save his own skin. The genius that had been the instrument of his son's death was now his only means of survival. The thought was a source of constant torment. Was this his curse? To be a creator of magnificent, fatal things? One night, hunched over a laptop in a cheap motel room, he was writing a piece of code to create a particularly complex false trail. The logic was intricate, designed to learn and adapt, to seem real. Suddenly, he was struck by a memory so sharp it made him gasp. He was back on Ethelgard, years ago, teaching a young Leo how to code a simple video game. They had worked on creating an AI for the game's villain, and Leo had been ecstatic when he'd figured out how to make it smart enough to trick the player. The memory, once a cherished, private treasure, was now agonizing. He was still playing a game, still trying to outsmart an AI, but the stakes were his own life, and his son was not there to celebrate his cleverness. After weeks of relentless digital warfare, he allowed himself a brief, dangerous moment to check the results of his work. He slipped back into the Shepherd network, his digital footprint as light as a moth's wing. He found what he was looking for in the project's efficiency reports. The system was overwhelmed. It was chasing thousands of false positives a day. His campaign of misinformation was working, bogging down the machine in a swamp of meaningless data. A grim, fleeting sense of victory touched him. But as he navigated further, his blood ran cold. He found a new log entry from the project director, dated just an hour ago. It was a memo addressed to Marcus Thorne himself. Subject: Asset Counterintelligence. Sir, the system is encountering sophisticated, targeted interference. The patterns are not random, they are intelligently designed. This confirms the asset is not only aware of Project Shepherd, but possesses the capability to actively resist it. Passive scanning is no longer sufficient. Per your contingency protocols, we are shifting the system from passive scanning to active hunting. All resources are now being triangulated to pinpoint the source of the interference. The ghost is fighting back. We are now hunting the echo. Daniel stared at the screen. The game had changed. He had poked the beast, and now it was no longer just scanning the forest for him. It had heard him, it had seen his tracks, and it was turning its unblinking eye directly towards the sound. The shadows were no longer a place to hide. They were the battleground. The words on the screen, active hunting and hunting the echo, were a declaration of war. Daniel's digital war of ghosts and shadows was over. The enemy was no longer just listening for his footsteps, it was actively trying to trace them back to him in the physical world. Every moment he spent connected to any network, no matter how secure he thought he was now an open invitation for Thorne's machine to find him. His strategy of hiding in plain sight was obsolete. He needed to go deeper underground, both metaphorically and literally. He shut down his machine, packed his meager belongings into a worn backpack, and walked out of the motel, melting into the city's anonymous morning rush. His mind, a supercomputer of strategic thought, was already working, sifting through old municipal blueprints and infrastructure maps he had downloaded months ago as a contingency. He was searching for a blind spot, a dead zone in the planet-spanning nervous system of Project Shepherd. He needed a place with access to raw power but no data lines, a forgotten corner of the grid. He found it in the city's skeletal past, a section of the old pneumatic subway system, abandoned in the 1930s, a forgotten labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath the city's financial district. Before he could make his way there, he needed to perform one last, critical task. He needed to plant a final complex piece of misdirection, a logic bomb that would activate in a few weeks, hopefully sending Shepherd on a long, fruitless chase to another continent. It was a risky move. It required him to connect to the network for a few precious minutes. He chose a sprawling university library, a place with a high volume of data traffic and a constantly shifting population of users. He found a terminal in a crowded corner, cloaking his presence behind the digital noise of 1,000 students. He worked with blistering speed, his fingers a blur on the keyboard, deploying the code through layers of proxies. He was so focused, so immersed in the digital stream, that he almost missed the warning. It wasn't a sound or a pop-up window. It was a faint, almost imperceptible lag in his connection, followed by a spike in the heat of his personal encryption key. His own counter-intrusion software, a silent guardian he had designed, flashed a single, terrifying alert on the corner of his screen. Triangulation attempt. Rapid lock. Estimated time to physical identification. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. The machine wasn't just tracking him, it was converging on his physical location in real time. He ripped his drive from the port, shoved his laptop into his bag, and stood up, moving with a fluid urgency that belied the chaos exploding in his mind. He didn't run. Running draws attention. He walked briskly, joining the flow of students heading out of the library. Once outside, the city he had used as a hiding place had transformed into a cage. Every security camera on every building felt like an eye watching him. A police car, sirens silent, turned a corner ahead of him. Coincidence? Or was Shepherd already interfacing with local law enforcement, flagging him as a person of interest? A commercial delivery drone buzzed overhead, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought it was one of Thorne's, its optical sensors scanning his face. He plunged into the nearest subway entrance, the roar of an approaching train a welcome sound. He swiped a prepaid transit card and pushed through the turnstile, not even looking to see which train it was. He got on just as the doors were closing, the train pulling away from the station. As he looked back through the window, he saw 2 uniformed transit police officers walking onto the platform, their eyes scanning the crowd. The chase, and his narrow escape, left him trembling, the adrenaline draining away to leave a cold, profound dread. He had felt that feeling before, the feeling of being trapped, of an omniscient power watching his every move. It was the same feeling he'd had on Ethelgard. He had flown across an ocean, put his own son in the grave, and endured a year of hollow grief, only to find himself in the same prison, just with taller, invisible walls. The thought brought a fresh, searing wave of grief. He was fighting so desperately for a life he didn't even want, a life defined by the absence of his son. After an hour of randomly switching trains, he emerged from the subway system miles away from the university. He found the access point he was looking for, a simple, rusted manhole cover in a forgotten alleyway. Under the cover of darkness, he pried it open. Below was a ladder descending into absolute blackness and the smell of cold, damp earth and ozone. He replaced the cover above him, plunging his world into a profound silence broken only by the drip of water. He had left the city of light and cameras behind, descending into the cold, silent earth. He had once built wings to conquer the sky. Now, his only hope for survival lay in the dark. The darkness below the city was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed the beam of Daniel's flashlight just a few feet from its source. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of a century of decay, rust, stagnant water, and damp, mineral-rich earth. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of water from the arched ceiling, each drop echoing in the oppressive silence like the ticking of a clock in a forgotten tomb. This was his new home, a modern labyrinth for a modern exile. He spent the first few days exploring, mapping his new domain. The abandoned pneumatic tunnels were a marvel of forgotten engineering, a network of cast iron tubes and crumbling brick archways. He finally chose his sanctuary, a large, cavernous junction chamber where several tunnels converged. It was dry, defensible, and most importantly, it was directly beneath a primary power conduit for the active subway system above. Survival required ingenuity. The man who had once harnessed geothermal energy to power an entire island now performed a far more dangerous and delicate operation. Using salvage tools, he carefully stripped back the conduit's heavy insulation, exposing the live, humming cables within. With the precision of a surgeon, he spliced into the city's power grid, creating an untraceable tap that siphoned just enough electricity to power his world without creating an anomaly that might be noticed by a municipal monitoring system. He reassembled his workshop. His computer rig, looking strangely alien in the ancient, cavernous space, hummed back to life. He had light. He had power. He had a connection to his enemy. In the ruins of the past, Daniel Ashford began to build his future. His strategy had to evolve. The days of creating digital noise were over. Any signal originating from him now was a beacon. He was a submarine, running silent, listening. He could no longer be a ghost haunting the entire network. He had to become an assassin, looking for a single, fatal blow. Hiding wasn't enough. Project Shepherd was a learning system. Given enough time, it would find him through a process of elimination, by noting the one place on the planet from which no data flowed. He had to dismantle the hunt itself. His new war was quiet, meticulous, and obsessive. 4 weeks that bled into months, he did nothing but map the digital empire of Marcus Thorne. He no longer slept in any regular pattern, working until exhaustion claimed him and waking hours later to the same perpetual darkness. In the absolute silence, with no distractions, his mind achieved a level of focus he hadn't known since his early days on Ethelgard. But the isolation came at a cost. With nothing but the drip of water and the hum of his machines for company, the ghosts of his past became his only companions. The memory of Leo was a constant, vivid presence in the darkness. He would have long one-sided conversations with his son, his voice a rough whisper in the echoing chamber. "You'd hate it down here, Leo," he'd murmur, staring at the lines of code on his screen. "No sun, no sky, but it's safe." He'd pause, the terrible irony of the word hanging in the air. Safer than the sky, anyway. He saw his reflection once in a still puddle of water on the floor. The man looking back was a stranger, gaunt and pale, with a wild, unkempt beard and eyes that had grown accustomed to the dark. He looked like a creature of the underworld, a man who had been buried alive. He realized that in his quest for survival, he was systematically erasing every last trace of the man he used to be. The fight was the only thing left. It was a complex, all-consuming problem, and solving it was the only thing keeping him from being completely devoured by the silent, waiting grief. And then, one day, deep in the 300th hour of his obsessive search, he found it. It wasn't a flaw in Project Shepherd's impenetrable code. It was something older, something more human. A legacy backdoor, a vanity access port that Thorne had ordered built into his personal financial systems years ago, a secret digital door for the king to his own vault. And critically, Daniel found a thread, a single strand of corrupted data, linking the project's secret, black budget, funding directly to that port. He stared at the glowing line of code on his screen. It was a key, a weapon, a potential kill switch not for the machine itself, but for the money that fed it. He could bleed the project dry, discredit it, make it a financial liability so great that even Thorne would be forced to abandon it. A grim, cold sense of triumph filled him. He was no longer just the hunted. He now had the means to fight back. But to use this key, to turn it in the lock, he would have to reach out, just for a moment, and touch his enemy's network. He would have to step out of the silent darkness and risk everything on a single, desperate gamble. The line of code glowed on the screen in the oppressive darkness of the tunnel, a single thread he could pull to unravel an empire. For the first time in over a year, Daniel felt a flicker of something other than grief or fear. It was a cold, sharp-edged feeling, purpose. But the triumph of his discovery quickly gave way to the crushing weight of the decision before him. He was a creator, a builder. His life's work had been about creation and discovery. Now, his survival depended on an act of pure, calculated destruction. He spent the next week preparing his weapon. It couldn't be a bomb, scattering digital shrapnel everywhere. It had to be a scalpel. He wrote the code with the same meticulous care he had used to design the wings, each line a perfect, efficient component in a machine of financial ruin. The program was designed to do 3 things with surgical precision. First, it would use Thorne's private backdoor to access the Shadow Ledger's funding project Shepherd. Second, it would reroute those billions of dollars into a complex web of offshore accounts and cryptocurrency tumblers, making them vanish completely. Finally, and most critically, it would rewrite the transaction logs, creating a perfect, undeniable digital paper trail that framed one of Marcus Thorne's most ambitious corporate rivals for the theft. It was an act of sabotage, but it was also a work of art. To hide his own tracks, he built a digital ghost of unprecedented complexity. The attack wouldn't originate from his tunnel. It would be launched from a dormant piece of malware he had planted on a Thorne Industries server in Zurich months ago. This sleeper agent would then route the signal through a chain of compromised satellites and data havens, a dizzying, untraceable path across the globe. For the attack to be traced back to him, Shepherd would have to be looking everywhere at once, at the exact right nanosecond. It was a gamble on the edge of a razor. As he worked, the ghost of his son was his silent observer. He remembered Leo's simple, straightforward sense of right and wrong. What would he think of his father now? A creature of the dark, weaving a web of lies and deception, preparing to unleash chaos. The thought was a fresh stab of guilt. He wasn't doing this for justice, not really. He was doing it to save himself. He was a cornered animal, willing to do anything to survive. He felt a sudden, shocking kinship with his son's final, fatal act. Leo, trapped in the safe corridor, had made a desperate, reckless gamble for a taste of true freedom, flying straight into the sun. Now Daniel, trapped in his own prison of paranoia, was about to make his own desperate gamble, flying metaphorically into the fiery heart of Marcus Thorne's power. He finally understood the terrifying, intoxicating pull of that one, single chance to break the cage. He chose his moment. Thorne Industries was scheduled to announce its quarterly earnings in 2 days. The global network would be flooded with traffic, its security systems focused on protecting the integrity of the financial reports. It was the perfect storm, the perfect cover. When the time came, the silence of his underground chamber was almost unbearable. He initiated the sequence. His fingers, steady and sure, typed the final command. On the screen, he watched the process unfold. The connection was made. The Zurich sleeper agent awakened. The signal began its impossible journey across the globe. A small window on his monitor showed the status of the connection to Thorne's private server. For 17 seconds, his attack vector would be theoretically exposed. 17 seconds for the active hunting protocols of Project Shepherd to detect the anomaly, trace a signal that was bouncing between continents, and triangulate his position. 17 seconds to determine his fate. He didn't breathe. The progress bar crept across the screen. 10%. 30%. The fans on his computer seemed to roar in the silence. 70%. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. 95%. He could feel the invisible eyes of the machine searching for him. Execution complete. Terminating connection. The words flashed in green. It was done. With a final command, he sent a wipe signal to the Zurich server, erasing the sleeper agent and the last link in the chain. He had done it. He had fired his shot. Daniel leaned back, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He cut all power to his rig, plunging his world back into absolute, silent darkness. He had no way of knowing what would happen next. There would be no instant confirmation of success, no explosion. He had simply planted a seed of chaos and now had to wait for it to bloom. He sat there in the dark, listening to the drip of water, and waited for the sound of the Empire falling, or for the hunters to finally break down his door. The silence after the storm was the worst part. Having fired his digital arrow, Daniel was now deaf, blind, and utterly alone in his tomb of iron and earth. He had severed all connections, transforming his sanctuary into a prison. For the next 48 hours, he existed in a state of suspended animation, every drip of water in the tunnel sounding like a footstep, every distant rumble of the subway above feeling like the precursor to a raid. He drifted between brief, nightmare-filled periods of sleep and long stretches of wide-eyed, paranoid wakefulness. He had gambled everything, and the waiting for the outcome was a unique and exquisite form of torture. On the third day, he could bear it no longer. He activated a small, heavily shielded receiver he had built, a passive device designed only to listen. He tuned it to the frequency of a public, all-news radio station. He wasn't transmitting, he was a ghost cupping a hand to his ear, listening to the world of the living. At first, there was only the usual chaotic hum of global news. Then, he heard it. A frantic report from the floor of the stock exchange. Panic selling of Thorne Industries stock, rumors of a catastrophic internal security failure are circulating. The reporter's voice was sharp with excitement. Daniel leaned closer to the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. The story dominated the news cycle for the rest of the day. It was chaos. Billions of dollars had vanished from Thorne Industries' private accounts. The digital trail, according to anonymous sources quoted by the media, pointed directly to their largest corporate rival. The rival issued furious denials. The market plunged. Pundits screamed of the largest corporate espionage act in history. From his cave deep beneath the city, Daniel listened to the symphony of destruction he had composed. In a glass-walled office atop the tallest skyscraper in the city, Marcus Thorne was not listening to the news. He was watching a holographic data stream, his face perfectly calm, his eyes as cold and hard as chips of obsidian. Across from him, his head of security, a severe woman named Elias, finished her report. The data trail is clean. It's a perfect frame job. It leads directly to Thorne Industries servers in Seoul. The authorities are ready to act on it. Thorne raised a hand, and she fell silent. He stared at the swirling data for a long moment. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "It's too perfect. Thorne is brutish. This is elegant. This is art." He turned his gaze from the hologram to Elias. "The money is irrelevant. Forget Thorne. This was him. The ghost from Ethelgard." A flicker of something that might have been admiration, quickly suppressed, crossed Thorne's face. "He's not just hiding in a cave somewhere. He's fighting back. He's mocking me." Thorne's voice dropped, becoming a blade of ice. "So, we will stop hunting and start exterminating. Shut down the Thorne investigation. I want every analyst, every resource from Project Shepherd, redirected. Their new and only objective is to analyze the ghost's attack signature." He left a fingerprint in the code he used. "An echo. I want them to find that echo. Take the money we were spending on Shepherd's global scan and use it to hire every freelance data mercenary and darknet tracker on the planet. Flood the grid with hunters. I don't care what it costs. Find the source of this attack. Find my property." Back in the tunnel, the news reports began to shift. Thorne Industries had issued a formal statement. They were no longer speaking of corporate espionage. The new language was stark, an unprecedented act of cyber-terrorism. They announced they were launching an internal investigation of unprecedented scale, cooperating with global authorities to hunt down the perpetrator. Daniel understood immediately. The frame job had failed to convince the one person it needed to. Thorne knew. The attack hadn't been a kill switch, it had been a dinner bell. He hadn't ended the hunt, he had focused it with a terrifying, vengeful clarity of a wounded predator. It was then that he heard it. A new sound, filtering down from the labyrinth of tunnels above. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic, grinding pulse of heavy drilling. It was probably nothing. Routine city maintenance. A new construction project. But in the suffocating silence of his tomb, it sounded like the steady, patient footsteps of a monster that now knew his name and was coming to collect. The drilling sound became the new rhythm of Daniel's life. It was a distant, grinding percussion that vibrated through the very rock of his sanctuary. At first, he tried to rationalize it. It was the city, a living organism constantly rebuilding itself. It was construction, subway maintenance, 1,000 logical possibilities that had nothing to do with him. But the sound was too systematic. It would start, run for a precise number of hours, stop, and then resume the next day, always a little closer. His paranoia, honed by months of being hunted, screamed a different truth. This was a search pattern. He could not risk connecting to the network to check city construction permits. Instead, he turned to the physical world. Using a discarded microphone from an old telephone handset and the sensitive processors from his rig, he built a crude but effective directional seismograph. He placed sensors at the mouths of the various tunnels leading from his chamber, creating a web to catch the vibrations. The data his device provided confirmed his worst fears. The drilling wasn't localized. It was a grid search, a series of deep core samples being taken throughout the city's underbelly. Thorne wasn't just relying on Shepherd's eyes in the sky. He was physically probing the darkness, sweeping the forgotten spaces beneath the city with methodical, brute force. The walls of his labyrinth were literally closing in. The constant, rhythmic grinding was a form of psychological warfare. It was the sound of his doom, approaching at a slow, inexorable pace. The oppressive silence he had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by this constant reminder of the hunter. The isolation began to work on him in new, more profound ways. He found himself thinking constantly of Leo's restless energy on Ethelgard, his desperation to escape the island's perfect, suffocating confines. Daniel now felt that same claustrophobia, a crushing pressure from the tons of earth and steel above him. In his quest to give his son the open sky, he had buried himself alive, and now the grave itself was shrinking. He knew he couldn't stay. His sanctuary was becoming a tomb. But where could he go? The world above was a digital minefield, watched by the unblinking eye of Project Shepherd. The world below was being systematically scoured by Thorne's search teams. He was caught between a satellite and a drill bit. As he frantically analyzed his options, a new, wildly audacious plan began to form in his mind. It was a strategy born of pure desperation, a leap of logic so counterintuitive it was either genius or suicidal. He couldn't fight Thorne's empire from the outside. The system was too vast, too powerful. Hiding from it was now impossible. Therefore, the only place left to hide was inside the system itself. He would become a cog in the machine that was hunting him. He would forge a new identity, a flawless digital life for a non-existent person, and get a low-level job at a sprawling, anonymous Thorne industry subsidiary in a different part of the country. He would hide in the lion's den, surrounded by the enemy, becoming just another face in the corporate crowd. The decision made, he moved with purpose. He spent a final, frantic day preparing. He wiped his main computer rig, destroying the heart of his underground workshop. All his research, all his tools, save for a single heavily encrypted hard drive he slipped into his pocket, were gone. He packed a small bag with the last of his supplies. That night, as the drilling sound seemed to echo from the very next tunnel over, he made his escape. He didn't go up, back into the city streets. He went deeper, following a long-forgotten drainage conduit that, according to the old maps, eventually emptied into the industrial canal at the city's edge. It was a desperate, filthy journey through miles of darkness and ice-cold water. He emerged hours later through a rusted grate, pulling himself onto a crumbling concrete embankment under the shadow of a decaying warehouse. He was soaked, shivering, and covered in filth, but he was out. He looked back at the city, a skyline of glittering lights that represented a vast, technological prison. He was a fugitive once more, on the run. But this time was different. The hunter had driven him from the shadows and from the earth. There was only one place left to hide. He was no longer running away from Marcus Thorne. He was running straight into the heart of his empire. The cross-country bus was a cocoon of stale air and rumbling motion, a perfect, anonymous space for a man who no longer existed to plot the birth of another. Daniel Ashford, the fugitive, was a ghost. To survive, he needed to give that ghost a body, a name, and a history. He was no longer building a machine of wire and code. He was building a person. This would be his most intricate and most dangerous creation. He needed a name that was a whisper, not a statement. After scrolling through decades of census data, he chose one, Owen Clark. It was a name of beige-colored simplicity, a name that could be found in any phone book and forgotten a moment later. The life of Owen Clark had to be equally unremarkable. He wouldn't be a reclusive genius. He would be a mid-level IT technician. A man who had spent the last 20 years as a freelance contractor, moving from city to city for short-term jobs. This transient lifestyle would provide the perfect cover for a life story with few deep roots and no close, long-term colleagues who might ask difficult questions. From a series of anonymous motel rooms across the Midwest, Daniel began the work of digital archaeology in reverse. He wasn't building a future, he was meticulously planting a past. Using his encrypted hard drive and a series of untraceable, disposable laptops, he began to weave Owen Clark into the fabric of the internet's long memory. He hacked into the archived servers of a defunct tech forum from 2012 and inserted a comment from a user named O. Clark, asking a question about a server migration. He found a list of participants for a 2016 charity 5K in a small town and added Owen Clark's name to the bottom. He created subscription records for trade magazines, library card applications, a sparse but consistent sediment of a life lived quietly on the digital fringes. The most dangerous step was creating the official documents, the pillars of a modern identity. A man is not real until a government says he is. Daniel spent days navigating the labyrinthine, archaic systems of national and state databases. He found what he was looking for in the archived records of a small, rural county. The birth certificate and social security number of an infant who had died in the 1970s, long before such records were cross-indexed and digitized. He was claiming a ghost's life for his own. With this foundation, he performed his most audacious act. He digitally aged a photograph of himself, adding 20 years of quiet disappointment to his features with a skill that would fool any facial recognition software. Then, posing as Owen Clark, he filed for a replacement driver's license online in a state known for its lax identity verification, directing it to be mailed to a private mail drop box he had rented under a different false name. As he worked, the process was a constant, grinding agony. He was painstakingly creating a fake life, full of manufactured details, a favorite sports team for Owen, a plausible list of past employers, while the real, vibrant life of his own son had been utterly erased from the world. He used an AI program to generate a plausible, boring photo of Owen Clark on a fishing trip, a picture to be used for a professional networking profile. As the image rendered, he was struck by a wave of grief so profound it almost buckled him. He had no pictures of Leo in the real world. No fishing trips, no birthdays, no memories captured outside the sterile walls of Ethelgard. He was building a fake past for a fake man because his real son had been denied a future. Finally, after 3 weeks of relentless, paranoid work, all the pieces were in place. He had the documents. He had a plausible, if unremarkable, digital history. And he had a target. Thorne Data Solutions, a massive, bureaucratic subsidiary of Thorne Industries, had an opening for an IT support technician at their sprawling campus in a featureless suburban landscape in Ohio. It was the perfect place to disappear, a corporate ocean with thousands of employees, a place where a quiet, competent, middle-aged technician named Owen Clark would be just one more drop of water. In a small, dark motel room, Daniel Ashford, the man who had built wings and defied a titan, took his final step into the shadows. He opened the Thorne Industries online application portal. He uploaded Owen Clark's resume. He filled in the blanks of a life that had never been lived. He took a deep breath, the breath of a man about to be born, and clicked the mouse. Daniel Ashford was dead. Owen Clark was about to apply for a job with the man who was hunting him. The email arrived 3 days later, a simple, automated notification in the inbox of an account that had existed for less than a month. Subject: your application with Thorne Data Solutions. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened it. We would like to invite you to a video interview for the IT support technician position. The first test was passed. Owen Clark was plausible enough to get a response. The feeling was a terrifying mixture of triumph and dread. The door to the lion's den had just creaked open. The interview was a masterclass in self-control. Daniel, now fully inhabiting the persona of Owen Clark, sat in the sterile business center of a budget hotel. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting tie. He had adjusted his webcam to give him the flat, unflattering lighting of a man who didn't know any better. On the other side of the screen was a relentlessly cheerful HR manager and a world-weary head of IT. They asked him basic questions, and Daniel, the man who had architected a self-sustaining island, had to pause and pretend to think before explaining the difference between RAM and a hard drive. He deliberately fumbled a question about advanced network security, framing his knowledge as a bit rusty, but eager to learn the Thorne way. He was Owen Clark, competent, quiet, unremarkable, and posing absolutely no threat. All the while, his mind raced with paranoid calculations. Were they running his voice through a stress analyzer? Was a facial recognition algorithm comparing his image to the last known photos of Daniel Ashford, a man who was officially dead? He must have played the part well. 48 hours later, a job offer appeared in his inbox. His first day at the Thorne Data Solutions campus in Ohio was a surreal descent into corporate anonymity. The facility was a sprawling, low-slung glass and concrete complex surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured lawn, an architectural monument to suburban boredom. He was herded through orientation with a group of other new hires, given a security badge with Owen Clark's face on it, and shown to his cubicle. It was a small gray box in a sea of identical gray boxes, one of thousands in the building. This was to be his world. His job was a form of active penance. He was the ghost in the machine, performing the machine's most menial tasks. His workdays consisted of a steady stream of tech support tickets. My password won't work. My printer is jammed. My screen is frozen. He would patiently walk employees through the solutions, his genius-level intellect devoted to solving problems that were, to him, trivially simple. He was a spy, and his cover was perfect mediocrity. He ate lunch alone in the crowded cafeteria. He nodded to his co-workers in the hallways. He never offered an opinion in a meeting. He became a piece of the furniture, a quiet, reliable part of the background hum of the office. But the constant proximity to his enemy was a nerve-shredding ordeal. The Thorne Industries logo was everywhere, on the screensavers, on coffee mugs, on the letterhead. It was a constant, silent accusation, a reminder of the man at the center of this vast web. Every corporate all-hands email from Marcus Thorne himself felt like a personal threat. And yet, this life gave him something invaluable, access. As an IT technician, he had legitimate, low-level credentials for the corporate intranet. He was inside the walls. His evenings were no longer spent attacking the fortress from the outside, but carefully, patiently mapping its interior. After his shift, he would remain in his cubicle, pretending to catch up on training modules. In reality, he was a silent observer on the network, a ghost moving through the corporate data streams, searching for any mention of Project Shepherd, Ethelgard, or the ongoing hunt. One afternoon, he was assigned a ticket for a young, ambitious programmer who had just joined the company. The young man was energetic, his eyes bright with excitement about the future, about the code he was writing, about the world of possibilities ahead of him. His enthusiasm was a painful, searing echo of Leo. Daniel fixed the issue with the man's computer, his hands moving with detached efficiency, but his mind was screaming. This was the life he had wanted for his son. This ordinary, hopeful, boring office life was the paradise Leo would now never know. That night, he stayed late, long after the building had grown quiet. He pushed his search deeper than ever before, using a security loophole he had noticed in the company's internal messaging system. He found a heavily redacted progress report from a department he knew, from his previous research, was a front for Shepard's data analysis division. Most of it was encrypted gibberish, but he managed to decrypt a single line of administrative text. Directive 7B, Asset Profile Updated. Asset is believed to be highly skilled in identity fabrication. All new hires across all subsidiaries, level 1 clearance and above, are to be flagged for mandatory secondary biometric and historical verification. A chill went down his spine. He was inside the fortress. But the fortress was beginning to check its own walls, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they found the ghost living within them. The words on the screen, mandatory secondary biometric and historical verification, were a death sentence for Owen Clark. Daniel sat frozen in the silence of the empty office, the hum of his computer a mocking whisper. His carefully constructed fortress had a secret, self-destruct sequence, and the timer had just been set. He wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. He was a foreign object about to be identified and purged. His first instinct was to run, to vanish back into the anonymous sprawl of the country. But he immediately crushed the thought. A sudden resignation from a new hire would be an instant, high-priority red flag. Project Shepherd's analytical AI would connect the dots in microseconds. His disappearance would be a confession, and the hunt would resume with a vengeance, this time with his new face and name. He couldn't run. He was trapped. The only way out was through. For the next few days, he became the model employee, quietly resolving printer jams and resetting passwords, all while his mind raced, waging a frantic, silent war. He dedicated every spare second of his low-level access to learning everything he could about the new screening protocol. He couldn't search for it directly. Instead, he monitored network traffic between the Human Resources Department and a third-party security contractor he knew Thorne used for sensitive operations. What he found chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just a background check, it was a digital autopsy of a person's life. The system cross-referenced everything: financial records, social media history, travel logs, and even biometric data scraped from security footage within the building, voice prints, gait analysis, typing cadence. It then used a predictive AI, a scaled-down version of Shepard's own logic engine, to flag any inconsistencies. Owen Clark's meticulously crafted but ultimately hollow identity would be torn apart in nanoseconds. Then he found the timeline. The screenings were being rolled out in phases, by division. A schedule was attached to the data packet. His division, Midwest Data Management, was scheduled to begin processing in 3 weeks. He had a deadline: 21 days until his ghost was exorcised. He needed a new plan, not of escape, but of sabotage. He had to corrupt the screening process itself, specifically for his file. He traced the flow of data and found its heart, a single, isolated, black box server located on site. This server aggregated all the raw data for the screenings before feeding it to the analytical AI. If he could access that server, he could intercept the data. He could alter the report for Owen Clark, changing the AI's conclusion from identity anomalous to verified. But there was a problem. The server was air-gapped from the main corporate network. It was physically, not just digitally, secure. It was located in the building's central data center, a high-security vault in the sub-basement. His IT credentials would not get him through that door. He needed to physically break in. The quiet, meek IT technician began to plan a heist. His days were a careful ballet of reconnaissance. He took on a ticket to fix a network issue in an office adjacent to the data center, allowing him to observe the keypad lock on the door and the patrol route of the guards. He accidentally struck up a conversation with one of the senior network engineers in the cafeteria, a man who worked in the data center, and under the guise of admiration, asked about the cooling systems and power redundancies, subtly gathering information about the room's internal layout. The process of planning the infiltration was a painful echo of a different time. As he studied the building's ventilation schematics on his screen, searching for a possible entry point, his mind flashed back to a similar night on Ethelgard. He saw himself and Leo, huddled over a datapad, tracing the flight path to freedom. He remembered the look in Leo's eyes, a mixture of terror and fierce, brilliant hope. That plan had been for the boundless sky. This one was for a windowless, refrigerated room. That had been a desperate bid for a real life. This was a desperate bid to preserve a fake one. The crushing irony settled on him, a weight heavier than all the concrete and steel above his old tunnel. His grand, tragic dream had shrunk to this, a lonely, silent fight for the right to remain in a gray cubicle. The night before his division's files were scheduled for processing, Owen Clark was the last person to leave the office, just as he was most nights. He nodded to the security guard on his way out. But he didn't go to the parking lot. He slipped into a darkened maintenance stairwell. In his hand, he carried a small, nondescript gym bag. Inside was not a change of clothes, but a set of specialized tools he had acquired or built over the last 3 weeks. He was no longer just an IT technician. He was an intruder. The time for hiding in the digital shadows was over. To save the ghost of Owen Clark, Daniel Ashford would have to walk through the walls of his own cage. The silence of the corporate office at 2 a.m. was a fragile, temporary thing. Daniel, now fully committed to his desperate plan, moved through the darkened hallways like a phantom. The building's skeleton crew of cleaners had finished their rounds. The lone night shift security guard was on his patrol on the upper floors. Daniel had a window of approximately 90 minutes. His target was the ventilation access panel in a disused storage closet on the floor directly above the data center. The lock was a simple one, easily bypassed. He pulled himself up into the shaft, the cold, dusty metal groaning under his weight. The world shrank to a cramped, rectangular tunnel of darkness. It was a claustrophobic echo of his escape from the city, a physical manifestation of how his world had continued to shrink. He crawled on his hands and knees, following the route he had memorized from the schematics, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. He positioned himself above the data center. Through the grate, he could see it, the cold, humming heart of the machine. Rows and rows of monolithic black servers, their blinking lights like a galaxy of malevolent stars. The roar of the industrial cooling fans was a constant, deafening hum. Getting inside the room itself was the next challenge. The door was protected by a sophisticated electronic lock and pressure plates on the floor. Going through it was impossible. But his reconnaissance had revealed a flaw. The room was a sealed, self-contained environment, but it had one vulnerability, the fire suppression system. From his bag, he removed a small, custom-built device. It was an aerosol canister attached to a precise heating element. He activated it and pushed it through the grate. The device released a targeted burst of synthetic smoke, just enough to trigger a single heat sensor directly below. He wasn't starting a fire, he was simulating one. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft chime echoed through the data center, and the magnetic lock on the main door disengaged with a heavy thud, a standard safety protocol. He had 30 seconds before the system rerouted and the lock re-engaged. He scrambled from the vents, dropped silently to the floor of the hallway, and slipped through the open door just as it began to close. He was in. The immediate blast of Arctic air and the sheer volume of the fans were disorienting. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the server racks. He found the black box, an isolated, heavily shielded unit in a locked cabinet, just as the engineer had described. He used a high-torque silent drill to disable the lock, the sound of the bit whining, swallowed by the roar of the fans. He couldn't risk plugging directly into the server. Instead, he clamped a device he had built, a passive data bridge, onto the server's main fiber optic cable. It was a masterpiece of miniature engineering, designed to read and inject data into the light stream without interrupting the signal, leaving no digital trace of the intrusion. He connected his datapad and went to work. He was a surgeon, operating on the building's central nervous system. He found the queue of employee files for the secondary screening. He found the file for Clark Owen. He could see the raw data, his forged history, his biometric data from the interview, all of it flagged with dozens of microscopic inconsistencies. The AI's preliminary conclusion was already attached, 97.8% probability of identity fabrication. Recommend immediate asset isolation. His fingers flew across the screen. He wasn't just deleting the conclusion, he was replacing it with a clean one. He built a new summary, full of the benign, boring data of a verified, low-threat employee. It was the most important lie he had ever told. Suddenly, a small icon on his datapad flashed red. He had hacked into the building's security network, and it was showing him a new alert. The fire suppression event in the data center, though automatically resolved, had logged a minor anomaly. The night guard, bored on his rounds, had decided to check it out. He was heading towards the sub-basement. He was 2 minutes away. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He expedited the final command. The screen flashed data write complete. He ripped the data bridge from the cable, shoved his gear into his bag, and relocked the server cabinet. He couldn't go out the way he came in. The guard was coming. He scrambled towards the back of the room, towards an emergency exit he had noted on the schematics, one that led to an external service corridor. He slipped through the door a mere 10 seconds before the guard entered the data center from the main entrance. The guard would find the door locked and see nothing amiss on his patrol. The anomaly would be dismissed as another system glitch. Daniel emerged into the pre-dawn chill of the service alley, his heart pounding, his body drenched in cold sweat. He looked up at the monolithic, sleeping building. He had walked into the heart of the beast, tampered with its memory, and walked out again. The heist was over. He had gambled everything in the cold, humming heart of the machine. Now, all he could do was go back to his cubicle and wait for the system to either declare him innocent or pronounce his death sentence. The days that followed the heist were the longest of Daniel's life. He returned to his gray cubicle, to the meaningless cycle of passwords and printer jams. He was a man who had walked through fire, now forced to sit perfectly still and pretend he didn't smell of smoke. Every email from a supervisor, every polite nod from a coworker, every ring of his desk phone was a potential thunderclap. He was a ghost holding his breath, waiting for the exorcism. The verdict arrived not with a security team breaking down his door, but with the quiet banality of a corporate email 2 weeks later. The subject line was simple: HR notification, verification complete. His hand trembled as he clicked it open. Dear Owen Clark, the message began. This email is to confirm that your mandatory secondary biometric and historical verification has been successfully completed. We appreciate your cooperation. Welcome, officially, to the Thorne Industries family. He read the words 3 times. A wave of relief so profound it left him dizzy washed over him. He had done it. He had stared into the unblinking eye of the machine and made it believe his lie. The ticking clock in his head fell silent. Owen Clark was real. Daniel Ashford was safe. A year later, Owen Clark was a model employee. He had received a commendation for his quiet efficiency. He had moved from his transient apartment to a small, sterile suburban townhouse in a gated community. His life was a flat, predictable landscape of work, groceries, and sleep. He had achieved the perfect camouflage, a life of such profound mediocrity that it was transparent to the world. The hunt was over. He occasionally monitored the network from a secure, isolated device, and saw that Project Shepard's internal status had been retasked. The hunt for the ghost of Ethelgard was officially a cold case, the asset presumed dead. He had won. But as the months stretched into a year, the silence he had fought so desperately for began to feel like a different kind of prison. He was safe, but he was utterly alone. He couldn't risk forming friendships. A real connection would invite questions his manufactured past couldn't answer. He couldn't pursue any meaningful work. Any flash of his true genius would be a beacon in the dark. He, a man who had held the future in his hands, now spent his days ensuring that other, lesser minds could access their spreadsheets. The grief for Leo did not diminish with time. It became the silent, invisible architecture of his new life. Every child's laugh he heard in the grocery store, every movie poster showing a soaring hero, every mention of the ocean was a new, quiet torment. This safe, gray world he had won was the very world he had failed to give his son. His survival was not a victory. It was a constant, unending reminder of his loss. One clear, cool autumn evening, he was standing in his living room, looking out the window at the manicured perfection of his suburban neighborhood. In a small park across the street, a father was teaching his young son how to fly a kite. Daniel watched, frozen. The kite, a simple diamond of bright red plastic, caught the wind. It climbed, dancing and soaring, a fragile, beautiful thing against the vast, open sky. The boy on the ground shouted with pure, uncontained joy, his face turned towards the sun. The image shattered Daniel's carefully constructed piece. A father, a son, a delicate creation, soaring towards the heavens. It was all there. The hope, the joy, the beautiful, terrible risk. It was the echo of his own story, stripped of its tragic grandeur and played out in a simple, perfect moment he could never have. He looked around his quiet, tastefully decorated townhouse. On a shelf was a small plastic plaque he had received, Thorne Data Solutions, Employee of the Month. The truth settled upon him, a final, crushing weight. He had not escaped Ethelgard. He had simply exchanged one gilded cage for another. The first had been an island of gleaming steel and silent servers. This one was a prison of fear, of suffocating safety, of a grief that had no end. The ancient myth was not just about the son who flew too high and perished in the sun. It was also about the father, the master craftsman who survived. It was about Daedalus, who reached the shore alone, and who had to live out the rest of his days on solid ground, forever haunted by the memory of flight and the ghost of his fallen son. Daniel Ashford had survived. He had outsmarted the monster and navigated the labyrinth. But as he turned away from the window, leaving the father and son to their kite and their sky, he knew he would never be free. He was safe in his quiet house, in his quiet life, forever flying the long, lonely middle path between the sea of his memories and the sun he could no longer bear to look at.